The tile count was something I'd been doing unconsciously for so long that I'd stopped thinking of it as unusual. 14 tiles across aisle 6, right shoulder to left wall. That's how I knew the building. Not by its address on Mercer Road, not by the name Farewell Family Grocery, which had been family-owned until 2019, and then wasn't, but by its dimensions in floor tiles, shelf bays, and fluorescent panel intervals. I'd been closing this store 3 nights a week for 11 years. The night I noticed something wrong, it was a Tuesday in late October, just after 10. The last customer had left around 9:40, which was early even for a weeknight. Marcus, who managed the front end and was technically my supervisor in the way that a $10 hourly rate makes one person another person's supervisor, had already done the register pulls and headed out. He trusted me with the keys because I'd never given him a reason not to, and because closing alone meant he could be home by 10:15 instead of 11. I didn't mind. I'd minded less and less over the years, which I understood was its own kind of problem. My routine after Marcus left was fixed: mop the restrooms, sweep the produce section, check the cooler temperatures, do a walk of every aisle to pull any items that had been damaged or misplaced during the day, kill the secondary lights one section at a time, and lock up. The walk was my favorite part. The store after closing had a quality I found hard to describe. Not peaceful exactly, but settled. The kind of quiet a room earns after holding all that ordinary human movement, and then finally letting it go. Aisle 6 was the last one before the back stockroom corridor. Dry goods, canned vegetables, boxed pasta, cooking oils. Nothing dramatic. I'd walked it more times than I could count. I was pulling a misplaced bottle of olive oil from the bottom shelf near the far end when I noticed the aisle didn't end where it should. At first I thought I'd simply stopped paying attention to distance. That happens at night, when you're tired and the light overhead is all the same flat white, and there's no reference point moving toward you. I was maybe 2/3 down aisle 6, and the back wall should have been 20 or 25 feet ahead, but it wasn't. The aisle continued. I walked toward where the wall should have been. I counted tiles. 14 across the width, same as always. But the length kept going past the point where the back corridor wall existed on the other side, past the point where the exterior loading bay wall existed beyond that, into another 10 feet or so of shelved aisle that simply had no building around it that I could account for. It ended, eventually. There was a back wall of shelving, the same particle board and metal style as the rest, stocked with canned goods in the ordinary way. I stood at the end of the extra section for probably 30 seconds before walking back out toward the front. I was not frightened, not exactly. I was the kind of unsettled that comes from catching an arithmetic error in something you'd assumed was simple. I went to the loading bay. The back wall of the building was exactly where it had always been: the metal door, the rubber weather stripping, the old grease stain on the concrete that maintenance had never fully gotten out. I stood outside in the October cold for a minute and looked at the exterior wall. I paced off the building's length from the bay door to the corner, same as it had always been, near as I could tell. I went back inside. I walked aisle 6 again, counted floor tiles from the front display cap to the back wall. I'd always counted them without registering the number, just the rhythm. Now I counted deliberately. 48. 14 wide, 48 deep. I didn't know the exact old number. That was the problem. I knew the aisle had been shorter. I was certain of it the way you're certain your childhood bedroom was bigger until you stand in it again as an adult. And it isn't. But certainty without a number is just a feeling. I locked up and drove home. I have a daughter. Her name is Petra. She's 17, and she lives primarily with her mother in Dunmore, which is 22 miles from Farewell. I see her every other weekend, which she's had opinions about since she was old enough to form them. She doesn't call unless she needs something specific, and I've learned not to read that as anything beyond what it is. She's a teenager. I was also a person who made choices that have consequences, and Petra having limited patience for my schedule is one of them. I mention this only because that Tuesday night, when I got home and sat at my kitchen table for a while before sleeping, I wasn't thinking about the aisle. I was thinking about a text she'd sent 3 days earlier that I still hadn't answered. It wasn't a complicated text. She'd asked whether I was coming to her choir concert the following Friday. I kept composing answers in my head, and none of them felt right because the honest answer was that my schedule made Friday evenings complicated, and the version of that I could say to her, without it sounding like an excuse, was something I hadn't figured out yet. I went to bed and told myself the aisle was probably a measurement error, either mine or someone else's. I measured it the next morning before opening. 43 tiles long. I counted twice. Then I went and got the measuring tape from the stockroom and measured it properly. 43 feet, 4 inches from the front display cap to the back wall. I went outside and paced off the exterior. The building from the corner to the bay door was 51 feet, which, accounting for wall thickness and the back corridor, put aisle 6 at somewhere between 42 and 44 feet. So 43 was correct. 48 was what I had counted the night before. I stood in the aisle for a while, looking at the back wall. The canned goods were shelved the same as always. Kidney beans, garbanzo beans, diced tomatoes. A facing of chicken broth with a dented can I'd been meaning to pull. The end cap was the same. The shelf spacing was standard. I checked my phone. I'd measured 23 times before, silently, as a habit. I didn't keep records of it. The day shift came in. I stocked the dairy case, unloaded a pallet of dry goods, and didn't say anything to anyone about the tiles. That Wednesday night, I closed alone again. The store had a mid-month schedule gap. One of the other closers, a part-timer named Renata, was out for a family thing, so Marcus had asked if I could cover. I said yes without particularly thinking about it. I usually did. After Marcus left, I did the mop and sweep and cooler check first. Then I went to aisle 6 with the measuring tape, 51 feet, 9 inches. The aisle was longer than the building's exterior. I walked it twice, measuring from 2 different starting points. The tape didn't lie. I went outside through the loading bay and paced from the bay door to the far corner. 51 feet, same as always. I went back inside. The aisle extended 8 inches past the point where the exterior wall existed. 8 inches wasn't much, but the exterior wall was concrete block. There was no room for 8 inches of additional interior space that didn't correspond to anything on the outside. I pressed my hand against the back wall of the aisle. It felt like the particle board shelving it always felt like. The wall behind the shelving, when I leaned close and looked at the gap between the bottom shelf and the floor, looked like drywall. The same drywall that made up every interior wall in the store. I took out my phone and photographed the measuring tape against the floor, front to back in 3 sections. Then I walked back outside and photographed the exterior wall. Then I stood in the parking lot in the cold for a few minutes, looking at the building. Farewell Family Grocery was a single-story concrete block building built in 1971, renovated in 1994, and the renovation records were still posted in the stockroom on a laminated sheet that nobody had read in at least a decade. I knew the building. I had spent more time inside it than inside any other single structure in my life, including the house I'd shared with my ex-wife. I went back to aisle 6 and walked the extra section again. The shelving here was stocked the same as the rest of the aisle. I looked more carefully this time. One of the cans, a can of crushed tomatoes, Store brand label had a small dent in the lid that I didn't remember. Not unusual. But next to it was a box of pasta, ziti, in the old store brand packaging. The design the store had used until 2021, when they'd switched to a new supplier and a new label. There shouldn't have been any old design stock left on the floor. We'd cycled it all out. I took the box off the shelf. The expiration date on the bottom read September 2019. I put it back exactly where it had been. I finished closing the store, locked up, sat in my car for a while, and then drove home. On the way, I called Petra. She didn't pick up, which I'd expected, and I left a voicemail telling her I would be at the concert on Friday. I didn't know how to arrange that yet, but I'd said it, so I would. I spent Thursday morning at the public library on Garfield Street, which still had a microfiche reader that most people my age pretended not to remember how to use. The town's building permits were archived online through 2003, and before that on microfiche, and before that in paper binders that the county records office kept in a room they'd let you sit in if you asked politely, and didn't look like you were going to steal anything. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. The 1994 renovation, maybe. Whether the building had ever been a different size, or whether the floor plan had changed in a way that left some dead measurement in the walls. The renovation permit for Farewell was straightforward. The 1994 work had been interior only, new drop ceiling, updated electrical, expanded produce section by removing a storage alcove near the front entrance. Nothing in the back. Nothing touching aisle 6 or the exterior dimensions. The original 1971 construction footprint was the same footprint on file now. A rectangle, 51 feet deep, roughly 90 feet across. I photographed the relevant pages and drove to work. The day shift was uneventful. I worked produce, then helped unload a dairy truck, then spent about an hour facing the dry goods aisles because the overnight stocker had left several sections loose. I walked through aisle 6 twice during my shift. 43 feet. Same as it had always been, apparently. That was the part I kept returning to. During business hours, in daylight, with other people moving through the store, the aisle was the correct length. Whatever I was measuring at night was something that only existed after closing. I didn't let myself sit with the implications of that for too long, because the implications were the kind that made it hard to function. On Thursday night, I asked Marcus a question. We were by the service desk around 8, and I tried to make it sound like routine curiosity. I told him I'd been thinking about the store layout and asked if he knew whether the back end of the building had ever had a different configuration. Another room back there. Something that got walled off in the renovation. Marcus was 44, had managed this store for 6 years, and had a habit of looking at you like you just changed the subject in the middle of a conversation he'd already checked out of. He said he didn't know, that the building was always the way it was when he started, and then he asked why. I said I'd noticed some variation in the floor tile count near the back of aisle 6 and thought it might be a repair patch. He shrugged and said to write up a maintenance request if I thought the floor was uneven. I said I would. That night, Thursday, my third night measuring, I brought a notebook. Marcus left at 10:15. I did the mop and sweep faster than usual, not rushing exactly, just efficient. Then I went to aisle 6 with the measuring tape and the notebook. 58 feet, 2 inches. I wrote it down. Then I sat on the floor at the midpoint of the aisle and looked toward the back. The new section 15 feet beyond where the wall should have been was shelved differently than the previous night's extra footage. The cans were still there, still the same general categories, but the arrangement had changed. Before, the end had looked like any other facing in the store. Products pulled forward, labels out. Tidy. Tonight, the arrangement was denser. Product stacked too deep in places. Some items turned sideways. Less like a grocery shelf and more like someone's pantry. I walked to the new section and looked at specific items. There was a brand of pickled beets I hadn't stocked in at least 4 years. The label design was correct for the period, and the price sticker on the bottom was in the old format we'd used before the store switched to shelf tag pricing in 2020. Hand-typed, with a small ink smear on the corner. I recognized the smear pattern. There'd been a specific label printer in the back office that had a crack in the ink cartridge housing for about 8 months before we replaced it. The smear was always in the upper left corner of whatever it printed. I had used that printer. I had stocked the beets that probably bore labels from that printer. Next to the pickled beets, there was a bottle of dish soap, a regional brand we'd carried briefly, maybe 18 months in 2016 and 2017, before they lost the distributor relationship and we stopped receiving it. The bottle had a small residue ring on the bottom, the kind you get when something sits on a slightly damp shelf surface. The residue was dry, old. I wasn't looking at new products. I was looking at old ones. The aisle wasn't growing forward into empty space. It was accumulating the store's past. I wrote down every item in the new section. 14 products. The oldest label format I could identify was from around 2012, based on the store brand redesign that year. So the range covered roughly a decade of stocking history. I took photos of everything. Before I left the section, I noticed something on the bottom shelf, in the far corner against the right wall. A can of creamed corn, store brand. Standard item, nothing unusual about the label. But it had a sticker on it that didn't belong. Not a price sticker, not a markdown label. A round yellow dot, the kind that comes in sheets from any office supply store. The kind we used internally to flag items that had been pulled from the floor and set aside for damage review. I had put those stickers on items myself, hundreds of times, but we hadn't used that system in 2 years. We'd switched to a digital log. I peeled the sticker off and put it in my notebook. I finished closing and sat in my car for longer than usual. What I understood by then, the aisle was not a spatial illusion or a measurement error. It was growing, specifically at night, and the growth contained genuine artifacts of the store's history, real products, real labels, real internal markings from specific periods. This wasn't random. Whatever was accumulating back there had access to the store's actual past, not a simulation of it. The part I didn't understand was the mechanism, or the purpose, if purpose was even a meaningful word to apply to it. I called Petra Friday morning. She answered, which surprised me. She confirmed the concert started at 7. She asked, without much warmth but without hostility either, if I was actually going to make it this time. I told her yes. She said okay, and then said she had to get to school, and that was the conversation. I'd missed 3 of her concerts in the past 2 years. The reasons had been a schedule conflict, a car issue, once a genuine miscommunication about the date. The reasons being real hadn't changed what they meant to her, and I'd known that and avoided sitting with it, which was its own kind of choice. Friday, I worked the afternoon shift. I stayed after my shift ended on some pretense about the cooler temperature log, waited for Marcus to leave, and then pulled every closing task in under an hour so I could measure the aisle before driving to Dunmore. 63 feet, 7 inches. New section tonight. A box of cereal. Discontinued brand, with the original cardboard insert still inside. A jar of pasta sauce with a handwritten expiration date extension sticker on the lid. We'd done those during the supply chain disruption in 2021, when we couldn't get consistent stock, and the district manager had authorized a 30-day shelf extension on certain non-perishables. The handwriting on the sticker was not mine. I looked at it for a while, trying to identify whose it was, but I couldn't place it. And there was a loyalty card, an old Farewell Family grocery loyalty card, The physical kind we'd stopped issuing around 2018 when the program went digital. The card was lying flat on the bottom shelf, partially tucked under a can of chicken broth. The magnetic strip faced up. The name printed on the front, in the small text below the barcode, was partially obscured by a shelf label that had come loose and folded over it, but I could see a first name: Dorothy. I knew a Dorothy. Specifically, I knew Dorothy Polk, who was 68 years old and had been shopping at this store every Thursday and Saturday morning for as long as I'd worked here. She lived about 4 blocks away on Clement Street. She had a specific parking spot she preferred, second from the door, first row, and she always paid cash and always had exact change, which she counted out slowly and without apology. Her preferred products were specific enough that I could have assembled her weekly shop from memory: the low-sodium chicken broth, the wheat bread with the orange label, a particular brand of instant oatmeal we sometimes had trouble keeping in stock. I picked up the loyalty card. Her full name, when I worked the folded label back, was Dorothy M. Polk. I put it in my notebook pocket. I locked up and drove to Dunmore. Made it to the school by 6:50. Found a seat in the 3rd row because the back was full, and watched Petra sing for 40 minutes with a choir that was better than I'd expected, and probably better than they knew. She was in the 2nd row, left side. She didn't see me until they were filing out after, and when she did, her expression did something complicated that she smoothed over quickly into a neutrality that I recognized because I'd taught it to her by example, which was not something I was proud of. We talked in the hallway for a few minutes. Her mother was there with her mother's boyfriend, and it was cordial in the way that cordial costs something. Petra said she was glad I came. I said I was too, which was true and also insufficient, but it was what I had. On the drive home, I kept thinking about Dorothy Polk's loyalty card in my notebook. The card couldn't have gotten into the aisle by accident. The physical loyalty card program had been discontinued 6 years ago. Any remaining cards would have been in customers' wallets or junk drawers, not in our stock. There was no legitimate reason for a card bearing a current customer's name to be on our shelf, which meant either someone had put it there deliberately, and I couldn't construct a plausible reason for that, or it had arrived through the same mechanism that was putting 50-year-old price labels and discontinued regional dish soap in my aisle. If the aisle was accumulating the store's past, Dorothy's loyalty card was from the store's past. She had shopped here for years before the program went digital. Her card would have been in regular use then. But the card being here now, in a section of aisle that hadn't existed before this week, that felt different from a discontinued jar of pasta sauce. The pasta sauce didn't belong to anyone specific. Dorothy Polk came to this store twice a week. She was a person, not an artifact. Saturday morning I was back on day shift. Dorothy came in at 9:40, which was normal for her Saturday. I watched her shop from the produce section, not in any way I'd have described as watching, just aware of her movement through the store, which was predictable enough to track without effort. She had her cart, her list written on the back of an envelope, her reading glasses pushed up on her head for when she needed to check a label. She went through the store in her usual route, counterclockwise from produce. She went down aisle 6. I found a reason to walk to the stockroom corridor, which gave me a sight line. She pulled the low-sodium chicken broth without checking the label. She knew exactly where it was and kept moving. She didn't stop at the end of the aisle. There was no end to stop at. In the daytime, 43 feet, correct dimensions. She paid and left. Exact change. Second parking spot. I went and stood at the back of aisle 6 and looked at the wall and tried to think clearly. Whatever the aisle was accumulating was specific. It wasn't random old store inventory. It was old store inventory connected to this store's actual operational history. and now it had produced something connected to a specific living person who was still here, still shopping, still arriving twice a week with exact change. I didn't know what that meant, but the direction it pointed was one I didn't like, that the aisle wasn't only gathering the past, it was gathering something about the present too, the connection between them, the people who had continued from one period into the other. I went home that afternoon and looked at the yellow dot sticker I'd peeled off the can of creamed corn. I'd been trying to remember the damage review system we'd used when we still put those stickers on items. The protocol was simple. Pull the item, apply the dot, set it in the designated bin on the back shelf of the stockroom, log it for the weekly damage report. Items that were clearly unsaleable got disposed of. Items that were borderline went back on the floor after the manager reviewed them. The bin was still in the stockroom. We just didn't use it anymore. I hadn't looked inside it in 2 years. I drove back to the store at 9 that evening. Marcus was closing, and I told him I'd left my phone charger in the stockroom, which was plausible enough. He let me in. The bin was a plastic milk crate shoved under the bottom shelf of the stockroom's back wall. I pulled it out. Inside, 3 items. A can of tomato paste with a dented side, a box of cornstarch with a torn corner, and a small plastic bag containing a folded piece of paper. The paper had my handwriting on it. It was a damage log entry I recognized the format I'd used when I was still filling those out by hand. The date at the top was October 11th. No year. I was standing in the stockroom with Marcus 20 feet away at the service desk, and I was reading a damage log entry in my own handwriting that either I had no memory of writing, or that had been written by someone who had learned to replicate my handwriting, or that had come from somewhere I could not account for, on a date that corresponded to the current week, but contained no year to anchor it. I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. I told Marcus I had the charger and headed out. The damage log entry read exactly the way I used to write them. Item description, shelf location, reason for pull, initials. The reason listed was label integrity moisture exposure. The shelf location was aisle 6, bay 11, bottom shelf. My initials at the bottom, D.W. Denny Warwick. That's me. I'd been writing those logs for years before we switched systems. My format was specific. I always wrote the shelf location before the reason, which was the reverse of how the template suggested doing it. I'd developed the habit early and never corrected it. Marcus had mentioned it once, mildly, and I'd kept doing it anyway because the information was the same either way. The entry on the paper in my pocket followed my format exactly. The item, creamed corn, store brand, 12 ounce, which was the can I'd found the yellow dot sticker on 2 nights ago, in the extra section of aisle 6, in a portion of the aisle that hadn't existed before this week. I sat in my car in the parking lot and read the entry 3 more times. The handwriting was mine. I'm not someone with unusually distinctive penmanship. My handwriting is ordinary block print, with a slight leftward slant, but certain letters have habits. My lowercase g closes completely. My numeral 1 has a small serif base. Both were there. Either I had written this entry at some point in the past and had no memory of it, or the aisle was producing documents in my handwriting. Neither interpretation was stable. I drove home. I did not sleep well. Sunday, I was off. I spent the morning trying to remember every can of creamed corn I had ever pulled from a shelf, which was a useless exercise, and I knew it was useless while I was doing it. I'd pulled hundreds of damaged items over 11 years. I didn't retain individual memories of them. The log entry could have corresponded to something I'd done years ago. The yellow dot sticker could have belonged to a can that I'd logged, returned to the stockroom. And then what? Somehow ended up in a section of aisle that didn't exist until this week? The only scenario in which the log entry made sense was one in which time inside the aisle wasn't behaving the way time behaved everywhere else. I'd been thinking of the aisle as accumulating the store's past, objects from previous years, arranging themselves in an extension of space that grew a few feet longer each night. But the damage log complicated that. The log was a document I'd created, not a product the store had stocked. It was an artifact of my own labor, filed in my own handwriting, and it had ended up in the same location as a can. I'd apparently processed through the damage system a can that was sitting in an aisle section that couldn't exist. I called Renata on Sunday afternoon. Renata had worked at Farewell longer than Marcus, longer than almost anyone else currently on staff. She'd started in the early 2000s as a teenager, gone part-time during her kids' early years, and come back full-time around 2015. She knew the store's operational history better than the store's own records did, because she'd been present for it instead of inheriting it. I told her I had a question about the old damage review system. She said she remembered it. I asked if there'd ever been a period where items from the damage bin had been returned to the floor without being properly logged out, just pulled from the bin, restocked without a formal clearance. She thought about it. Said, yeah, probably. Said there'd been a stretch in 2015 or 2016 when the damage log binder had gone missing for a few weeks. She thought someone had taken it to use as a general stockroom log by mistake. And during that time, some items had probably moved around without proper documentation. She asked why. I told her I was trying to reconcile some inventory discrepancies. She said it sounded like a lot of effort for something that didn't affect current operations. I said I had a methodical personality. She laughed a little and said she knew that. After she hung up, I sat with the new information. 2015 or 2016. A period of incomplete documentation. I'd been working at Farewell since 2013. The stretch Renata described would have included years of my early tenure, when I was still building the habits I'd carried forward. What I hadn't asked Renata, because I hadn't known how to ask it without sounding unwell, was whether she'd ever noticed anything unusual about aisle 6 after closing. Whether the store had always felt the same to her in the end of night hours as it did during the day. I decided I was going to tell someone. Not Marcus. Marcus would hear it as a performance issue and respond accordingly. Not Renata over the phone. I needed to show someone, and the only way to show someone was after closing, which meant either asking Marcus to stay late on a pretext or bringing someone in without Marcus knowing. The second option was easier and more dishonest, and I chose it without deliberating very long. Monday night, Marcus closed. Tuesday was mine again. I texted Renata on Monday and asked if she'd be willing to come in Tuesday night after close. I told her I wanted to show her something in the stockroom related to the inventory question, and that it would take 20 minutes. She said she could come by around 10:30. I spent Monday trying to think about whether this was a reasonable thing to do. Bringing someone in after hours without authorization was a minor thing. In practice, Renata had keys. We'd both been trusted with access for years, but it was the kind of thing that could become a larger thing, depending on how Marcus interpreted it. I told myself it was fine. I told myself it was necessary. What I didn't examine carefully enough was why I'd chosen Renata specifically. She'd been there a long time. She knew the store. I trusted her. All true. But I think the real reason was that she was the person least likely to react to what I was about to show her in a way that would make me feel like I'd done something wrong by noticing it. That distinction matters. I wasn't looking for a witness. I was looking for someone who would help me feel less alone in having seen something I couldn't explain, which is different from being honest about what I needed. Tuesday night. I closed fast, same as before. Marcus left at 10:12. I texted Renata. She came in through the loading bay at 10:28. She had her coat on and her hair still up from her shift earlier in the day. She looked at me when she came in the way people look at you when they've agreed to something they haven't fully committed to yet. I handed her my notebook. The measurements, the dates, the product list from each new section, the photos on my phone. She went through it. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "You measured this yourself?" I said yes. She said, "Every night?" I said yes. She said, "Okay," and handed the notebook back. "Show me." We walked to aisle 6. I had the measuring tape. I stretched it from the front display cap to the back wall. 68 feet, 4 inches. 9 feet longer than the building's exterior allowed. Renata stood at the 60-foot mark past where the exterior wall should have been and put her hand flat on the shelf next to her. She looked at the products. She walked the remaining 8 feet to the actual back wall of the aisle and stood there looking at the shelving. She was quiet for a long time. She said, "I know that brand," and pointed at the discontinued pasta sauce. "We stopped carrying that because the distributor raised their minimum order and it wasn't worth it. That was," she stopped. "That was 2018, I think." 2017, I said. "November." She looked at me. "How do you know that?" "I remember stocking the last case." She nodded slowly. She pulled the jar off the shelf and turned it over, looked at the bottom, put it back. Then she crouched down and looked at the bottom shelf, at the product arrangement, at the way items were spaced. She said, "Denny, who stocked this?" "I don't know." "No, I mean," she stood up. "This is faced. Someone pulled everything forward, every item on this shelf. You don't do that unless you're maintaining the section. You don't do it unless someone is coming back." I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd been looking at the products, not the shelf-keeping behavior. The extra section was maintained, not left in some accumulation of old stock, but actively cared for, faced and fronted the way you do at the end of a shift. "I didn't do it," I said. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "I know you didn't." We stood there for a moment. Then she said, "There's something else. Can I?" She walked past me toward the midpoint of the aisle, the normal section, the part of aisle 6 that had always existed. She stopped at bay 8, right side. She looked at the top shelf. "This isn't right," she said. I went and stood beside her. The top shelf, bay 8, right side. Canned tomatoes, crushed. Standard stock, current label design. But Renata was pointing at the shelf tag below the row of cans, the small printed label showing the product name, unit price, and SKU code. The SKU code was wrong. Not wrong in a random way. Wrong in a specific way. It was the old code, the pre-2020 code, the format we'd used before the inventory system update. "When did that get changed?" I asked. "I put the new shelf tags on this aisle myself, after the system update. March 2020. She touched the edge of the tag. "This is the old tag. This is not what I put up. You're sure? I printed them myself. I spent 2 days doing aisles 4 through 8. She looked at the tag, then at me. "Someone replaced it." I looked down the aisle at the other shelf tags. They all looked current. Just the one in bay 8 was wrong. I took a photo. "There's something I didn't put in the notebook," I said. I told her about the damage log entry, the paper in the stockroom bin, the creamed corn, my handwriting. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You didn't write it." "I don't remember writing it." "No, you didn't write it? Because I remember that bin. I remember the last time anyone used it." She said it evenly, like she was delivering something she'd decided to deliver carefully. "It was me. I logged the last item out of that bin when we switched systems. I removed everything that was in there, documented it in the new system, cleared the bin. There was nothing in it. When was that? June, 2 years ago. The bin had 3 items in it. I know. I heard you. She looked at the floor. The paper with your handwriting, do you still have it? I pulled it from my jacket pocket and unfolded it. She took it and looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, October 11th, no year. Right. She said, October 11th was my last day before the family leave I just took, the week I was out. I looked at her. The damage review log was part of my regular closing checklist, she said. If someone was going to put something in that bin and have it look like a routine entry, they'd have done it while I was out. So it wouldn't show up against my clearance record. Someone put it there deliberately. Someone put it there deliberately in your handwriting, she said. Which either means someone has access to examples of your handwriting and reproduced it, or she stopped. Or what? She handed the paper back. Or you wrote it, and it came from somewhere that doesn't account for time the way we do. She said it flatly, not dramatically. The way you say a thing you've decided to say because refusing to say it doesn't make it less true. Which is insane. I know that's insane. The aisle is 9 feet longer than the building, I said. She nodded. We stood in silence for a moment. Then I said, Renata, you came in through the loading bay tonight. Yes. Did the bay area look normal to you? She turned and looked toward the back of the store. Her expression changed. I didn't measure anything, she said. I just walked in. We went to the loading bay together. I pressed the exterior door open and held the measuring tape at the door frame while Renata walked the tape to the back wall of the bay. 19 feet. Correct. The exterior of the building was unchanged. But when I went back inside and measured from the loading bay interior wall to the beginning of the stockroom corridor, the distance that should have been a fixed 12 feet, it was 11 feet, 3 inches. The store was losing space on the near side. I measured it twice. Renata watched. Neither of us said anything right away. The aisle was adding length at the back. The store was losing it at the front. The total building dimensions, measured from the outside, hadn't changed. Whatever was happening inside, and the inside was rearranging itself around the aisle's growth. Renata said quietly, How long has the stockroom corridor been 11 feet? I don't know. I've only been measuring the aisle. She said, I need to think about this. So do I. I need to go home and think about this. Tonight. I can't. She pulled her coat tighter. I'm going to come back tomorrow night and we're going to measure everything. Every corridor, every aisle, the restrooms, the office, all of it. We're going to have a complete picture before we do anything else. I said, okay. She said, don't tell Marcus. I wasn't going to. She looked at me with that same expression from earlier, the one I still couldn't fully read. I know you weren't. That's what concerns me a little. That you've been watching this for a week, and your first instinct was to keep it to yourself. She wasn't saying it critically. She was saying it the way someone says something they've noticed and decided you should know they noticed. I'm not criticizing you. I'm just naming it. She left through the loading bay. I stood in the stockroom corridor and thought about what she'd said. She was right. My instinct had been to document privately, to verify before telling anyone, to maintain control over the information, until I understood it better. I'd told myself that was methodical, that it was prudent. The truer version was that I was someone who managed difficulty by converting it into a problem I could work on alone, and I'd been doing that so long and so consistently that Petra's choir concert had nearly been another victim of it. The aisle had been growing for a week, 9 feet, with the store visibly contracting around it, and I had been carrying it by myself like a logistical challenge. Renata's name was not on anything in that aisle. Her cards, her logs, her working history. Mine was. Wednesday, I got to the store at 8 in the morning and measured the stockroom corridor before anyone else arrived. 11 feet, 1 inch. It had lost 2 more inches overnight. I measured the store office next. The office was a small room off the stockroom desk, filing cabinet, the computer that ran the inventory system, a wall-mounted phone. It should have been 8 feet by 10. It was 7 feet, 11 inches by 9 feet, 8 inches. Not dramatically smaller. Small enough that you'd have to be looking for it to notice. Small enough that if I hadn't been measuring, I might have walked in there for 3 years before feeling like something was slightly off, and not being able to say what. I wrote everything in the notebook. The day shift was ordinary. I worked it without incident, watching the dimensions of things, and noticing that the noticing itself had started to feel like a new kind of work. I kept track of where I was in the building by habit, the way I always had. But now, the habit had an edge to it. Every time I turned a corner, some part of me was checking whether the hallway felt right. At 7 that evening, before the closing shift began, I measured aisle 6, 43 feet. Same as every daytime measurement I'd taken. The aisle only extended after closing. Renata came in at 10:45. Marcus had left at 10:20. We spent 40 minutes measuring the entire interior of the building. She took one side of each aisle, and I took the other. We measured corridors, the restroom hallway, the produce prep room, the walk-in cooler, the stockroom in 3 sections. We wrote everything down separately and compared numbers. The summary: every room adjacent to aisle 6 had contracted. The stockroom was down 11 inches in total linear footage. The office had lost 8 inches from its depth. The hallway connecting the stockroom to the restrooms, a hallway I had never thought about, was 4 inches shorter than the building plans documented in the permit records. The aisles flanking aisle 6 were normal. Aisle 5 and aisle 7 were correct within a ½ inch, which was within normal measurement variation. Only the spaces directly behind aisle 6 were being consumed. And aisle 6 itself, after closing, was now 72 feet, 1 inch long. That was Renata's measurement. She did it twice. I did it once and got 72 feet, 3 inches. We averaged it. 29 feet of aisle that didn't correspond to any exterior dimension of the building. Renata stood at the 60-foot mark and looked toward the back. The new section tonight had more product than any previous night. The shelves were fully stocked, densely arranged, and the facing was meticulous. Whatever was maintaining this section was doing it correctly. Better than correctly. The facing was tighter than anything on the regular floor. She pointed to the second shelf on the right, about halfway through the new section. "That's mine," she said. A bottle of antacids. Store brand. The old label. "We used to keep antacids in aisle 4, she said. "We moved them to the pharmacy section in 2019. Before that, they were here, on this shelf, in this bay." She pointed to the exact position. I remember because I restocked them every other Tuesday for about 2 years, and the bottlenecks kept falling over because the shelf lip was slightly warped. She crouched down and looked at the shelf edge, pointed without touching it. "There, see how it's bent down slightly on the left?" The shelf lip was warped exactly as she described. A small downward curve at the left edge, maybe 2 centimeters of deflection. "That shelf defect doesn't exist in the current store," she said. "I had it replaced in 2019 when we did the planogram reset." She stood up. "This is aisle 6 as it was before 2019. I thought about what that meant for a moment. "Not as it was," I said. "As it is. Continuously." She looked at me. "The old version of the aisle didn't stop existing," I said. "It's still here. It never stopped being here. The new version grew over it." I was working it out as I said it. The renovation in 1994. The planogram resets. Every time the store changed, the previous version of the space didn't disappear. It compressed, pushed back, and now it's pushing out again. Through aisle 6, specifically. Through the path of least resistance. The most used aisle. The one with the most consistent stocking history. Renata looked uncomfortable. Denny, the damage log entry with your handwriting. What about it? If the aisle contains the store's past as a continuous present, the antacids, the warped shelf, the old SKU tag, it should also contain the past labor that maintained it. She paused. Your handwriting on that log entry. You said you didn't remember writing it. I don't. But you might have written it. At some point in the past, in a version of this store that the aisle is still running. I'd been avoiding the full shape of this thought, and now it was in front of me. You're saying there's a version of me back there. I'm saying there might be evidence that you worked in a section of this store that has been persisting outside of your awareness. That the labor you put into this place over 11 years, she stopped and started again. You said your name was on everything in that aisle. Your log entries, your sticker system. My methods, I said. My facing habits, my stocking patterns. Yes. We looked at each other. I've been here 11 years, I said, and I've spent more time in this building than anywhere else in my life. More than my apartment. More than my daughter's mother's house, even when I lived there. I said it without self-pity. It was just a fact, and it landed between us as a fact. What happens, Renata said carefully, if the aisle keeps growing and the spaces behind it keep shrinking? At some point, the stockroom goes, then the office, then the back half of the sales floor, and then it reaches the front of the store. Or the building's exterior structure fails because the interior no longer matches the load-bearing math. I thought about it. Though it's maintained itself this far without any visible structural problems. How long before it reaches the front? I looked at the notebook. The rate of growth had been roughly 5 to 8 feet per night over the past week. The total interior space behind aisle 6, the stockroom, the office, the corridors, was maybe 60 feet of linear space across all connected rooms. At current rates, 3 to 4 weeks. And after the store, Renata said. Does it stop? I didn't answer, because I didn't have a reasonable answer. Dorothy Polk's loyalty card was still in my notebook. I took it out and held it. Renata looked at it. Whose is that? I told her. She was quiet for a moment. You're thinking the aisle has some connection to her. She's been shopping here since before I started. She's part of the store's continuous history the same way I am. Lots of customers are. She comes every Thursday and Saturday. Same time, same route, same products. She's been doing it for at least 15 years that I know of. I thought about how to say it. She's as consistent a presence in this store as any employee. Renata looked at the loyalty card. What are you thinking, Denny? I wasn't certain yet, but the shape of it was becoming clearer, and I didn't like the shape. The aisle was preserving the continuous present of the store, all of its history, running alongside the current version of itself. The people who had contributed the most sustained, consistent presence to that history. Their traces were here. My handwriting, my stocking patterns, my methods, a loyalty card bearing Dorothy's name, a warped shelf that Renata had spent 2 years working around. The question was, what would happen to the people whose traces were here if the aisle continued to absorb the store around it? I said, I need to go into the back section. Renata said, I know. Further than I've gone before, to the end, to see what's past the last section that's grown so far. And if it grows faster while you're in it? It only grows overnight. I don't know if that means it only grows when the store is closed, or when the building is unoccupied, or "We're in it now," she said, after close. I looked at the back of the aisle. "Come back out before midnight," she said. "That gives you an hour." "You're not coming. One of us needs to stay at the entrance and monitor whether it changes while you're inside. And it's your name on everything in there." She said the last part without accusation. I don't think it wants me. I thought about challenging the word "wants." I decided it was probably accurate enough to leave alone. I walked to the back of the currently visible aisle 72 feet from the front and kept going. The shelf arrangement beyond the measured end was different. The products became less current the further I walked. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. The labels shifted. Older designs. I passed a section stocked with a coffee brand we'd carried until 2014. Then a row of soup cans in the label design I remembered from my first year at Farewell. Then a section with a brand of crackers that I was fairly sure had been discontinued before I started before 2013, because I'd never stocked them myself. But the box design was familiar in the way things are familiar when you've seen them as a child in someone else's shopping cart. The light didn't change. The fluorescent panels continued overhead. Same flat white, same 60 Hz hum. The floor tiles were 14 across, the same as always, though I stopped counting after 80 feet, because counting had started to feel beside the point. At approximately 90 feet, I found a section I recognized specifically. Bay configuration, shelf height, product category. This was the dry goods arrangement from around 2007 or 2008, based on the brands and the label designs. But that wasn't why I recognized it. I recognized it because of the shelf tag in Bay 3, bottom row. The handwriting on the tag was not printed. It was written by hand in black marker, in handwriting that was not mine, and that I knew immediately because I'd seen it on schedules and notes for 2 years before its owner moved on. Carl Whitmore had worked at Farewell from some time before I started until 2015, when he'd taken a job at a distribution warehouse and stopped coming in. He'd been the senior stock clerk, the person I'd learned most of the job from in my first 2 years. His handwriting was distinctive, large, rounded letters, the K always slightly backward. The shelf tag was in his hand. The date on the tag was March 2009. Carl had written this tag in March 2009, and it was here, preserved, in what the aisle had decided was the continuous present of this store. And I didn't know where Carl was now. We'd lost touch. He'd moved to somewhere in the eastern part of the state, I thought. We'd never been friends in the sense of maintaining contact, but he'd been a daily presence in my life for 2 years, and then wasn't. I kept walking. At 104 feet, I stopped. The aisle ended here. Not with a wall of shelving, not with a defined back panel. The shelves simply stopped. The last bay on each side terminated, and beyond them was not darkness, not emptiness. More of the same floor tile, the same overhead lighting, extending for a distance I couldn't determine. The light didn't diminish. The tiles continued, but there was nothing on either side. No shelves, no walls visible, just the tiled floor and the fluorescent panels overhead, going forward into a space that had no visible boundary. I stood at the last shelf bay and looked out into it. On the floor, at the exact center of the last tile before the open space began, was a can of creamed corn, store brand. The same can I'd found the yellow dot sticker on. I was certain it was the same can because of the dent in the lid. Not a damaged dent, a small, shallow impression near the rim. The exact shape you get when a case collapses slightly in the corner during shipping. I had pulled this can. I had applied the yellow dot. I had put it in the damage bin. Sometime between that action and this moment, in a direction I couldn't account for, it had ended up here. At the boundary of whatever the aisle became when it stopped being an aisle. I crouched and picked it up. The pull tab on the lid had been opened. Partially, not all the way, just enough to break the seal. Inside, visible through the narrow gap, was a piece of paper, folded small. I stood in the borderless light at the end of a grocery aisle that was longer than the building holding it, holding a can of creamed corn that I had processed myself at some point in the past. And I understood for the first time that whatever this space was, it had been expecting me specifically. Not as a consequence of chance, or because I worked here. Because 11 years of sustained, methodical, daily presence had made me continuous with this place in some way that went past employment. I had given more of my consistent self to this building than to my daughter, than to my marriage, than to any person or place outside of it. And the building had kept all of it, somewhere in a space running alongside the one I could see. The note inside the can could be from Carl. It could be in my own handwriting again. It could be neither. I didn't know yet. What I knew was that opening it was not the decision. The decision was what I would do with whatever it contained, and whether that action would take me further into the open space beyond the last shelf bay, or back toward the entrance where Renata was waiting with a notebook and the correct dimensions of a building that was slowly becoming incorrect. The can was in my hands. The paper was inside it. I worked the lid tab the rest of the way around with my thumb and set the lid on the floor beside me. The paper was folded into quarters. I unfolded it. A shift schedule. The Farewell Family Grocery Weekly template. The pre-2018 format. Printed on the paper stock we'd used before the system update. My name was blocked into 4 slots. Carl's name was in 2. Renata's in 3. The header date read, week of October 8th. No year. I looked at the hours next to my name. 42 for the week. 5 shifts. I'd worked stretches like that in the middle years, 2015 or 2016, when the arithmetic of my life outside this building had stopped adding up, and I'd let the job absorb the overflow. Petra would have been 7. The marriage was failing in the specific way that failing marriages do when neither person is willing to name it first through schedule conflicts and careful politeness, and both people separately deciding they were simply very tired. I'd worked 42-hour weeks in this store because it was easier than being somewhere I didn't know how to be. The schedule wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't a message in any conventional sense. It was the aisle returning another piece of my own continuous past, the same way it had returned the damage log entry, and the yellow dot sticker, and the creamed corn with the shipping corner dent in the lid. Here is what you gave. Here is the specific shape of it. Here is the year you gave it, instead of something else. I folded the schedule and put it in my jacket pocket alongside the damage log entry. Then I looked out into the open space past the last bay. The light out there was identical to the aisle's light. Same flat white, same 60 Hz quality. The floor tiles ran forward in a regular grid. There was no back wall, no visible ceiling boundary, no sign of where or whether it ended. It wasn't dark. It wasn't hostile in any obvious way. It was simply unbounded, which was its own distinct problem, and I stood at the edge of it for a moment and understood something. Going further was the wrong interpretation. The aisle had been offering me a week of evidence, and I'd been reading it as a puzzle to solve measuring it, photographing it, documenting it, bringing in Renata to verify my findings, treating it the way I treated everything difficult, which was as a problem I could manage by collecting enough correct information. But the evidence wasn't a puzzle. It was a record. My own record, assembled and held by a space that had kept better track of my sustained presence than I had. Going into the open space would be another way of going further into the work. And the work was not what needed more of me tonight. I turned around and walked back toward the front. The return felt longer than the walk in, but only slightly. Maybe an extra half-minute over the full distance. The shelves modernized as I moved toward the exit, old label formats giving way to newer ones, discontinued brands cycling back into current stock, the store reassembling itself into the present as I moved through it. By the time I reached the 43-foot mark, I was in the normal aisle, under the normal lights, in the building as it currently stood. Renata was sitting on the floor at the end cap with her back against the display, which was something I'd seen her do on slow nights years ago when her feet hurt. She looked up. 11:48, she said. I checked my watch. She was right. I'd gone in just before 11. Felt like 30 minutes. She stood up and looked at me with the specific attention she'd been giving me all evening. What's back there? I told her about the open space, the way the shelves ended, the floor tiles continuing without a visible wall. I told her about the shift schedule, the date, the hours, what the hours meant about the period they came from. When I finished, she said, "So it's yours, the bulk of it." "Because of why I put the time in," I said. "Not just that I put it in. Anyone who closes 3 nights a week for 11 years accumulates hours. What I was doing was using this place as somewhere to be instead of using it as a job. Those aren't the same thing, and the aisle seems to know the difference." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does it need you to do?" "I don't think it needs me to do anything with what's in it. I think it's been showing it to me because I've been looking at it from the side for a decade, and this is the most direct it can get." I looked down the aisle. The problem is that understanding that doesn't stop the contraction. The stockroom is still losing inches. The office is still wrong. Whatever's happening is still happening. Yes. So the question I've been avoiding is what to do about it practically. Tonight. Not metaphorically. She crossed her arms. Not defensively, just waiting. Option 1 is I tell Marcus and let it go up the chain. Option 2 is I keep measuring and try to determine if there's a rate ceiling, a point where it stabilizes. I stopped. But Dorothy Paulk comes in Thursday morning. If the rate holds, by Thursday the contraction will have reached the first portion of the sales floor. And I don't know anymore that the aisle stays normal during business hours. The stockroom doesn't reset. The office doesn't reset. The daytime rule might just be the last rule to break. Renata looks toward the front of the store. She goes counterclockwise. Produce, dairy, then back through the aisles. She'd reach aisle 6, maybe 20 minutes into her shop. Neither of us said anything for a moment. I took Dorothy's loyalty card out of my notebook and held it. Then I took out my phone. "I'm calling Marcus," I said. Renata looked at me. Not because I have a good explanation. Because if I wait until I have a good explanation, I'll be in this aisle for another week, and the front of the store will go, and I'll have waited too long again. I looked at the card, then put it back in my pocket. I've been managing this the same way I manage everything alone. Documented, controlled, until I understand it completely enough to feel safe handing it to someone else. That's not caution. That's just a habit I've been calling caution. She didn't argue with it. Marcus picked up on the 4th ring. His voice was rough with sleep and immediately tight, the way it gets from middle-of-the-night work calls, because they usually mean something is flooding or someone is hurt. I told him I was still in the store. I told him I'd found a problem with the building's interior dimensions that needed him to see it before we opened Thursday. I told him Renata was with me. He said, "What do you mean, a problem with the dimensions?" I said, "The store is smaller than it should be in the back, and aisle 6 is longer than the exterior of the building allows." Silence. "Denny, I know how it sounds. How long have you known? A week?" A longer silence. I heard him sit up. "You've known something was wrong with the building for a week and didn't say anything." "Yes." The quiet that followed was the kind I recognized from 6 years of working under him, the controlled version. The one that came before a very measured response to something that warranted a less measured one. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, and the line went dead. Renata looked at me. "How'd he take it?" "He's coming." She nodded and picked up her coat from the floor. "For what it's worth, I think you made the right call." "A week late." "Yes. Tonight instead of next week. That's usually how those calls go. You make them when you can, not when it would have been ideal." Marcus was there in 18 minutes, through the loading bay. He walked the shortened stockroom corridor without reacting to it, which meant either it had fractionally recovered, or he simply had no basis for comparison. I showed him the notebook, every measurement, every date, every product notation. I showed him the photos. I measured aisle 6 in front of him with the tape, 72 feet, 4 inches. 3 more inches than when I'd gone in. I took him outside to the loading bay and showed him the exterior wall, unchanged, 51 feet from corner to bay door, same as the permit documentation. He stood in the extra section of the aisle for a long time. He looked at the old pasta sauce, the discontinued dish soap, the antacid bottles with the pre-2019 label design. He crouched and looked at the warped shelf lip. He checked the old shelf tag in Bay 8. He was not a person who argued with direct physical evidence, which was one of the things about him I'd always respected. He said, "I'm calling district facilities. It's 12:30. I know what time it is." He looked at the back of the aisle, at the full length of it extending past where the building ended. "I'm going to tell them I found this tonight. Not that it came to me after a week." He looked at me directly. "Because that conversation is between you and me, and I'm not having it right now." "Okay. You still have a job, but we're going to talk." "I know." He walked away to make the call. Renata stood beside me and we looked down the aisle together in the quiet. The facilities manager, when Marcus reached him, said he'd have someone there by 8 in the morning. Marcus relayed this without editorial comment. He told us both to go home, said he'd stay until 6, and then return for the inspection, and said the store would be closed for the day. He'd post the notice and handle the day shift calls himself. I handed him the notebook before I left. He took it without looking at it immediately, tucked it under his arm and said, "Go home, Denny. One more time." Not unkindly, I went. The parking lot at 1:14 in the morning was empty except for my car and Marcus's. The building looked the same from the outside as it had looked for 11 years. Concrete block, flat roof, the faded F in farewell on the sign that facilities kept meaning to fix. Nothing about the exterior indicated that the interior no longer matched it, that somewhere behind the dry goods aisle, past the point where the building ran out of building, floor tiles continued into light without a wall to stop them. I sat in my car for a few minutes before starting it. The shift schedule and the damage log entry were in my jacket pocket. I took them out and looked at them on the passenger seat. 2 pieces of paper, both in my handwriting, both from dates that couldn't be precisely located. The record of work I'd done, and the record of the period when I'd been doing too much of it. I didn't know what to do with them. They didn't belong in my apartment. They didn't belong in the store, though that was where they'd come from. I put them in the glove compartment, which was a decision and not a decision. The kind of in-between place where things wait until you know what to do with them. I drove home. I thought about Dorothy Paulk the whole way. Whether she'd come in Thursday as usual and find a closure sign. Whether that would disrupt her morning and how much. And whether the disruption would matter to her. She'd been coming to that store twice a week for 15 years. She had a preferred parking spot and a route she ran counterclockwise, and products she knew by position rather than label. The store going dark for an inspection would be an ordinary inconvenience. She would find somewhere else to shop that Thursday, and probably she would come back the following week. and the question of whether she'd noticed that aisle 6 felt different was one I would never be able to ask her in any way she'd be able to answer. At home, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. It was the same table where I'd sat a week ago after the first night, when I'd been thinking about Petra's text. The same blue-gray surface, same ring stain from a mug I'd set down carelessly years ago and never done anything about. The concert had been 4 days ago. She'd said she was glad I came in a tone that left room for the fact that she'd expected otherwise. I'd heard it and hadn't addressed it directly, because addressing it directly would have meant saying something about the 3 concerts I'd missed, which would have required talking about why, which was a conversation I'd been constructing the ideal conditions for without ever finding them. The ideal conditions were the same as the complete explanation. Always one more piece of information away. I got up and went to bed. Set an alarm for 7, ahead of the 8 o'clock inspection. I slept, which surprised me. In the morning, I called her before the alarm went off. 6:52. She answered on the 3rd ring with a voice that was alert enough that she'd probably already been up, and for a moment I thought I'd interrupted something. I said, "It's early. I know. I wanted to catch you before school." She said, "Okay," in a way that was waiting. I said I wanted to take her to dinner, not my weekend, her mother's weekend, the coming Saturday, and I said I'd coordinate with her mother directly if she wanted, or she could, whichever was easier. I said I knew I'd been difficult to schedule, and I said it plainly, without trying to reframe it or explain it, because the reframe was the part that had been getting in the way. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You don't have to do that." "I want to." Another pause. "Saturday's fine. 6 o'clock. I'll be there." She said okay. Then she said, in a slightly different register, like she was deciding whether to say it, "I'm glad you came to the concert." "Me too," I said. "I should have come to the others." She didn't answer immediately. The line was quiet long enough that I thought she might let it go, which would have been her right. Then she said, "Yeah, you should have." No heat in it, just the fact of it, stated plainly, which was how she handled things when she was being direct rather than self-protective. She had learned the self-protection from me, and the directness from somewhere I'd had less influence over, and I was grateful for the second thing, even though I couldn't take any credit for it. We said goodbye. I got up and made coffee and drove to the store by 7:45. The facilities inspector was already in the parking lot when I arrived. A woman named Garrett from the district office who had a rolling case of equipment, and the expression of someone who had received an unusual phone call before sunrise and was reserving judgment. Marcus was with her. He looked like he hadn't slept. Marcus introduced me as the employee who had identified the issue. Garrett shook my hand and said she'd reviewed the photos and measurements I'd documented and wanted to walk the space. We went inside. She measured aisle 6 first, 43 feet. I measured it myself, right behind her, 43 feet. I stood at the back wall of the aisle and pressed my hand flat against the particle board shelving. Solid. Correct. The building on the other side of that wall was exactly where it had always been. Garrett measured the stockroom corridor, 12 feet, 1 inch within normal variation of the permitted dimension. She measured the office, 8 feet by 10 feet. Correct. I watched her work through every measurement I'd taken over the past week and get correct numbers for all of them, and I stood in the middle of it and understood that the store had returned to its documented dimensions sometime between 1:14 in the morning when I'd left and 7:45 when I'd arrived back. 72 feet of impossible aisle. Gone. Stockroom, normal. Office, normal. Marcus looked at me once during the inspection, not accusingly, more like he was waiting to see what I would do. I didn't say anything while Garrett was working. When she'd finished her full walk and was reviewing her notes at the service desk, I asked if I could look at her aisle measurement again. She handed me the tape. I stretched it from the front cap to the back wall. 43 feet, 2 inches. I handed it back and thanked her. She filed her report as no structural abnormality found. Dimensional measurements within normal parameters. No action required. She told Marcus the store could reopen. She was gone by 9:15. Marcus and I stood in the stock room after she left. He had the notebook I'd given him the night before. He held it without opening it. He said, "The measurements in here." "Yes. You took all of these yourself." Renata was present for the Wednesday night measurements. He nodded. He looked at the notebook. "I believe you documented what you documented," he said. "I want you to know that." He set the notebook on the stockroom shelf. "I also need you to understand that if you ever sit on something for a week again, anything, a leak, an equipment failure, something that seems impossible, I need to know the day you find it. Not when you figured out what it is. I understand." "Okay." He looked at the floor. "Store opens at 10. Go home and get some sleep if you want. You're not on the schedule today." I picked up the notebook. The aisle was 43 feet when I walked it one last time on my way out. Products current. Labels modern. Shelf tags correct. The warped shelf lip in Bay 3 of the extra section, the one Renata had identified, the one that had been replaced in 2019, was smooth. No deflection at the edge. The antacid bottles stood in their correct location in aisle 4, where we'd moved them years ago. I stopped at Bay 11, bottom shelf. The exact location the damage log entry had cited. The can of creamed corn I'd left at the boundary of the open space, it was here, back in its proper position on the current store shelf. No yellow dot sticker on it. No dent in the lid. A new can, or the same can returned, without any evidence of where it had been. I left it on the shelf. Outside, the morning was cold and clear. The parking lot was ordinary. I sat in my car and held the notebook and thought about Saturday dinner with Petra and how I would get there early so I was already at the table when she arrived, because that was a small thing I could do that meant something, and because the small things I'd been late to for years were still small things, which meant there were still enough of them left. I started the car and drove home in the ordinary light.